Welcome to our last program on the ghost of Simcoe County. Again, I'm Paul Rollinson, and I'm the one that's talking about ghosts, or maybe not ghosts, or given if you the fact that you've watched a few of the other programs, I'm skeptical of ghosts. However, this program is probably a little more serious. It's really deals with the ghosts of the soldiers that went to World War I from Simcoe County, and especially with special reference to the underage soldiers. But we'll probably get to that. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, the Native Trails were the first cross Canada trail, and all those trails, as Jamie mentioned, changed from trails for the Wendat people to trails for the Anishinaabe people, trails that interconnected all of Simcoe County. All of the men and women and animals that were involved in World War I probably traveled on dirt roads to get to where they needed to go. Vehicles weren't as common in 1914 as they were in the later Victorian or earlier Edwardian period. So those trails would have been walked by the men and the boys and all of the others that were going to war. I'm especially thinking about the underage soldiers, the boys. Underage soldiers were used in World War I, and ages 14 to 18, sometimes as young as 10, but they weren't soldiers in the field for the most at all that I know of. And I just want to sort of pay tribute to them. I'm going to be doing a poem by Robert Service, that famous Canadian. He isn't Canadian, he's actually Scottish, but he wrote a book of poetry in World War I called Rhymes of a Red Cross Man, because even though he was technically overage, he did serve with the Red Cross in an ambulance until he was injured and had to come out of the war. So I'm going to do a poem in tribute to all of those people from Simcoe County and everywhere at the end of this taping. But I just want to talk a little bit about the mentality of those Victorian teenagers and the Victorian men who joined up in 1914. If you were 14, you were underage, and you were joining up even in the Victorian area. 1900 Victorian period ends in 1901. So I want you to think about being a teenager, an underage soldier. We have them these days in various other places. We sort of decry that, but necessity is the mother of necessity. So that's what happened. People joined up for various reasons, especially the young man. There were no women in the trenches. However, giving credit to that, I should recommend a book that deals with women that dressed up as men and who did get into the service. It's called Amazons and Military Maids, women who dressed as men in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. It is really a very interesting read. There was one particularly, a British lady who it was quite a piece of work, and she got through the war dressed up as a man. No Canadian women that I know of did that, but I'm not the expert, and I stand to be corrected. But they did serve as nurses, and they did serve in the fact, they did their part in the war. They just weren't, men didn't allow them into the trenches. So that being said, I'm talking about the underage soldiers who were allowed, the teenagers, 14-year-olds, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, who were allowed in the trenches. Some of them got through, some of them didn't. It must have been an interesting time. In terms of the war, technology, the advance in technology is driven by the war. So over the course of the war, those men and boys and the world saw advances in vehicular invention. Motorcycles went from being basically a lawnmower engine on a bicycle to some motorcycles in the latter part of the war were quite a piece of work. So Harley Davidson and all of those other manufacturers, early manufacturers, were really just getting started. Submarines were part of science fiction. You know, Jules Verne wrote about submarines in the 19th century, and actually there was a steampunk that was devoted to Verne as well. All sorts of other technologies were driven. Airplanes went from canvas and probably an ancillary role in the war to being very important in terms of surveillance and bombing and warfare. They sort of, you know, replaced the Zeppelins, again, Victorian technology being replaced by necessity in the war. Tanks were invented in 1915 by the Brits because tracked vehicles were just starting, so that's where the tanks came from. And just an interesting fact about that is that they were called tanks for a reason. The men in the trenches were told that if they ever were questioned about what was going on with those things behind the trenches, they were told that to tell the Germans that they were water tanks. So that's the reason they were called tanks. They were told that they had to not give away the secret that this was a technology that was being developed. There are so many other examples of how war drove World War I technology and changed the world, going from the Victorian era into not the modern, but certainly a more advanced society. And just in terms of the underage soldiers, we'll get back to that for a few minutes. I did some work with Simcoe County Museum in their World War I program. And I did a little bit of reading, and there is a very good book on the underage soldiers in Canada called Old Enough to Fight. And I checked out a lot of the information here. There are a couple of people that were mentioned in this book. One of them was a guy by the name of Roy Henley, who was from Alliston. He was an underage soldier. He was about 14 when he got in. Apparently he was a fairly large guy, so a little bit easier for him to get in than some others. But really, all you had to do was say you were 18 to get into the army. They would take you. It doesn't matter what age you were. They didn't have a computer to check your ID. Those boys and men would come to the recruiting stations in the country. It would be on trails. Now the trails then were a little wider. They were more like wagon trails as opposed to just sort of walking trails. They were probably a little more direct than the native trails, which seemed to meander. But I've mentioned that in the previous last week's show. And they would get on a train, piece of technology some of them hadn't traveled on, and then they would end up in England and France and be in the thick of the war. Well, Roy ended up getting caught for being underage. I guess he got questioned, caught, and he was sent back. But he got back into the war by the time he just went to another recruiting station and got back into the war, as I understand it. And he got through the war. And he died in his 80s, and that was amazing. This guy who was 14 lived to be in his 80s, in spite of having gone and been in that First World War, which killed millions of people. And this is a story about ghosts, so there are millions of ghosts, and his is one of them that sort of it fills my story a bit, so I can stick to the idea of ghosts. But the interesting thing is that because I was working in World War I in their military program, I saw a lot of students. And one student, and what my job was to be a sergeant and to be really hardcore, and that's well and good because the students weren't used to someone being hardcore with them. Teachers enjoyed it too. But one of the interesting things, we were suiting everybody up to go out to be trained in the field, this one student pulled out her cell phone and sort of deked around a corner, and she was talking on the phone and talking on the phone and talking on the phone. And I thought, oh, maybe there's something wrong. I better check this out. So I went over and I asked her, I said, is everything okay? Is everything fine? She says, yeah. You were talking about Roy Henley. I was just checking with my mom, and that was Grandpa Roy. I'm his granddaughter, right? And at that moment, I realized that if Roy Henley, that underage soldier at 14, had not got through the war, that girl would not be standing in front of me. She wouldn't have existed. And I think if we all look into our own histories and our own past, and we look back and find someone who we might have been related to who fought in that war, or even any war, just remember you may not exist unless those people had come back to fight from the fight that they were engaged in. So that takes me on to the next little section, and I'm gonna change location, so you're gonna see things a little bit differently in a minute. You want me to tell you a story, a yarn from the firing line of our thin red khaki heroes out there where the bullets whine, out there where the bombs are busting and the cannons like hell's door slam. Buy me another drink, boys, and I'll tell you about Soulful Sam. Now, Sam was never hilarious, though some of his mates were thus. Never had a CB on his program and was never known to cuss. For a card or a skirt or a beer mug, he ne'er had a good word. But when it came to singing hymn tunes, boys, wasn't he just a bird? Carried tracts in his pocket, which he would haste to present, though some of the fellows used them in ways they were never meant. Me, I read 'em religious, and I was frequent impressed by those packs of holy dope that he carried around in his vest. For and I shudder at the horror these words will convey, I've been, and I'll say it quietly, a gambler half my days. A gambler, you see, a gambler, and it makes me want to weep. The fact of the matter is, boys, I'd rather gamble than sleep. And I've gambled the whole world over, from Montenegro to Maine, from Dawson City to Dover, from San Francisco to Spain. Cards, they've been my ruin. They've destroyed my pride and my pelf. And, when I want to play cards, I usually play by myself. And Sam, he would watch me for hours as I dealt out that greasy deck, and he'd say, "You're going to perdition!" And I'd say, "Sam, get off me bleeding neck." And that's how we came to be friendly, though we both had a different plan. Me, a desperate gambler. Sam, such a fine young man. But let me get on with my story. Just imagine darkness, the battlefront, the vicious Hun attacking, and us bearing the brunt. Me hiding behind a sandbag just to stay calm when I hear someone singing a hymn tune. And behold, it's Soulful Sam. There in the midst of the battle with all its fury and fire and flame, Sam is shooting and singing serenely as if they're both the same. And then at the peak of the battle, just before they attacked, Sam reached into his tunic and he handed me a religious tract. Well, by the light of a star shall I read it. "Oh, flee ye for the wrath to come." Now ain't that a great message to get out there where the bullets hum? But before I had a chance to thank him, just one of those pieces of lead came slinging along in a hurry, and it hit me partner. Was he dead? No, sirree. Not by a long shot. It hammered him hard in the chest, right in the pocket where he carried those tracts to give to the army boys, which was tucked away in his vest. On his horrible mission of death, that bullet had hustled along and caved a hole in those tracks, boy, but the life of my pal was saved. Well, as Sam was proclaiming his triumph, and his words were choking my breath, along came another bullet on its horrible mission of death. Through the night it cavorted, seeking its haven of rest, and it hit me bang on the breast. "Was I killed?" you asked. No, of course not. Now look at me. I'm standing right here with a sorrowful look on my face and a mug that's empty of beer. My throat is so parched. Boys, oh, thank ye. Don't mind if I do. Beer with a dash of Hollands. Now, ain't that my favorite brew? It was a terrible time, boys. It hammered me hard over the heart, knocked me down like a 9-pin, and I was just looking for the gore to start. And I saw in a moment at that point, amidst all this thunder and strife, I really started to understand what is the meaning of life. For you see, boys, I had no tracts to save me from that mad missile's doom, and I had no pious pamphlets to save me from death's dark tomb, and I had no flyers to baffle that bullet's aim. All I had, boys, was my deck of cards, and they worked just the same. Now, you know, I'm going to add something to this song, boys, this poem, boys. After 100 years, I think there's something that needs to be added. And what needs to be added is, when you expire and enter the ether, God only knows where you will land. It won't matter if you prayed or played poker. In this game, we all hold a dead man's hand. But what you might need is a pal when you get there. And your best bet on that round, you see, would be to ask for Sam or his pal the gambler. One of us will be there at least, and we'll be your pal for eternity. All right, boys, all right. Amen. Praise the Lord, but pass that damn ammunition.
You're good.
In any case, that's the best I could do on that Ballad of Soulful Sam, with all apologies to Robert's service, but you got the sense of what was going on in that poem. I'd like to sort of say at this point, that was dedicated to all those who are involved in, especially World War I, but all wars. It's not easy. One final thing I forgot to mention, there's another book on the boy soldiers of the Great War. It's British. That's what it's called. And it will give you some insights into those stories of those young men that sacrificed themselves before they were 20, a long time ago. That's it. Happy to have done something for you. There's lots of other ghosts out there, ghosts of the past that we could talk about, but maybe next year.